Here it said Solomon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed. Now underline this phrase. By Ruth, Obed begot Jesse. Now this morning we're going to be looking at the book of Ruth, the 4-chapter book of Ruth. And many people want to understand, and many scholars even debate why even the book of Ruth is in our English Bibles. Because if you look at the book of Ruth, there's really no mention of God. There's the mention of Jehovah as being Lord, but really there's no kind of interaction with God, even though God's hand is definitely there, as we're going to see here in a moment, and as we talk about Matthew chapter 1 and verse number 5. But the reason the book of Ruth is in our Bibles is because of the providence of God, because of the lineage that shows us leading to Christ, and because God reserved and kept that lineage to be able to bring forth His Son and to fulfill all those Old Testament prophecies. You think about the promise of Abraham there. He goes, I'll make thee a great nation, right? And through your seed, all nations of the earth shall be blessed. Well, how is that going to happen? Through Abraham's seed, what's eventually going to come take place? Jesus the Christ, right? Well, when you have a son, and that big son has a son, and then eventually they never have a son, and the husbands die, and that woman's never able to bear a child and keep the lineage going, what's going to happen? That family tree, that lineage stops right there. But here we can see, because of God's providence, because He's going to fulfill prophecy, because of a whole host of other things, we see that God put Ruth, Obed, and all these different people, Boaz, into the Bible because it's to fulfill prophecy, to show the lineage of Christ and Him truly loving us by bringing us Jesus. So let's go to Ruth, the book of Ruth now. Now, one thing that I learned in preparing for this lesson that I had never really paid attention to or really understood was that this is really a play. You know, you read a play and it's, a lot of narratives, right? It's conversations, it's dialogue. Really, that's what the book of Ruth is all about. There's 85 verses here in the book of Ruth, and out of the 85 verses, 55 of them are dialogue. It's conversations that take place. It's a conversation between Ruth and her mother-in-law. It's a conversation between Ruth and her eventual husband, the kinsman, the redeemer. But as we read this book, it's very important to pay attention to who's talking, what's going on, and why they are doing what they are doing. Now, I only have roughly 35 minutes left, so I'm going to be running through this book. What we're going to do this morning is we're going to look chapter by chapter at what this book of Ruth is all about. Really, this whole book of Ruth, as you can see there on your screen, it's a story of redemption. It's buying them back. It's keeping that family lineage going so that Christ can eventually come and save the whole world from their sins. And as we read this book of Ruth, it's all about love. Love. I mean, you're going to see Ruth's dedication to her mother-in-law. You're going to see Ruth's love for her family. You're going to see Ruth's love for her people. And you're going to see that throughout this book. So chapter number 1, as we look at this, that was not supposed to pop up all at once, but anyways, chapter number 1 is about pain. And chapter number 1, verses 1 through 5 is really the only background, the historical points that we're going to understand from this book. And then really the rest of the book is dialogue. It's that conversations between characters and things like that. So verses 1 through 5 is going to give us a lot of background about what's taking place, when it's happening, what's going on, why the events occur that's about to occur, all those different types of things. But it's really all centered around pain. There's a lot of pain that goes through in chapter number 1. Let's notice this. Look at Ruth chapter 1 and verse number 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. Now let's stop right there just for a second. This tells us the time period in which this book was occurring. Okay? Now remember, if you read the book of Judges, a common phrase throughout that book of Judges is what? They did right what was in their own eyes, right? They did what they wanted to do. They were rebellious towards God, and they did what they wanted to do. So remember that they were rebellious towards God, and that they did what was right in their own eyes, okay? Now, the time period in which this happened, if you want to write in the margin of your Bibles, is about 1300 to 1100 BC. That's the time of the judges. So somewhere within those 200 years is when this book of Ruth fits into history. So it fits into history sometime between 1300 BC and 1100 BC. Now, look at this next phrase. So there's happening during the times of the judges that there was a famine in the land. Now, history tells us, now they are going to harvest barley and harvest wheat and those different types of things in this book. And one thing that history tells us is that there were early rains, R-A-I-N-S, not rains as far as kings, but early rains. There was rains, and then there was the latter rains. Now, what would happen is these early rains that would happen about the time of October and November in this area where Ruth was at in Moab and that surrounding area, what would happen is these early rains would come and it would break up the soil. Okay, it would get the soil ready to be able to plant and to harvest and all those different types of things. Well, what would happen is if they didn't get these early rains and they just got rains, well, the soil was hard. It wasn't able to penetrate the seed into the soil. And what would happen is they would get rains. And what happens to that soil since it's not in the soil? It would just wash off the land and they would have no crops. So that's exactly what's happening here is because they did not get early rains to break up that soil so the seed can penetrate into the ground. They just got these rains and it washed off all the seeds, so they are not able to get the produce that they were wanting. And then notice here it says, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, look at the characters that we're going to be talking about in verse number 2. The name of the man was Elimelech. Now, Elimelech, his name means God is king. God. El is God. Me is my God. Elimelech, king. My God is king is what that name literally means in the Hebrew. And then notice this, and it's funny that the reason I'm telling you these names is not just to tell you, but it's because many times in the Bible, there's a play on words behind their historical name. Now notice this next one. It says, and his wife's name, so Elimelech's wife's name is Naomi. Now, Naomi's name in the Hebrew means pleasant one. Now, as we read through this story, because of the pain that is inflicted upon Naomi, she is not a pleasant one. Okay? Many times in the Bible, we look at names such as Naomi, and we see that they're not fulfilling their name. Like in the New Testament, when we look at that one chapter book of Philemon, and we talk about Onesimus, that runaway slave, his name literally means useful, that is profitable. Well, guess what? He's away from his master. He's not being profitable, and he's not fulfilling his name. Here we're going to see that Naomi is kind of in the same situation, and she is not fulfilling her name of being a pleasant one. She's an angry one. She's going to turn bitter, and we're going to talk about that as we get to chapter number 2. And the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chelon. Okay, now, you know, many times people go to the Bible to find their kids' names, right? These are 2 that they do not use at all, okay? And here, these 2 names are very interesting in their meaning because it's going to show us why things happen in the next verse. The first one, Mahlon, literally means wasting, okay? Mahlon means wasting, and Chilon means puny. Now, if you name your 2 sons wasting and puny, it's kind of a sad situation, right? Probably they're not very healthy, right? They're wasting and they're puny. Puny, you know, they're not going to last very long. Notice what happens. Ephraim, that's kind of interesting here. The Ephraimites of Bethlehem, that was a very fruitful and prosperous land. Judah, and they went into the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she left her 2 sons. So Naomi now is a widow. She is not have anybody to be with. She is now a widowed woman. Now look at verse 4. And they, talking about the two sons, Puny and Wasting, took wives, the woman of Moab. Now stop right there just for a second. Was this the correct biblical thing to do during this time? No. They weren't supposed to take women from a foreign land, were they? They weren't supposed to marry these strange women as we talk about in the Bible. Okay, these women who were from a different country. That was against the law during that time. But what did they do? They did something that was improper to do. They married these women from Moab. And now, as we read this book, if you really understand the relationship, because they're going to go back to their hometown and they're going to bring these two women back with them, Ruth in particular, as we're going to talk about, that's a relationship that people really didn't like. Okay? And we're going to see that, and people talk about that in chapter number 2 and verse number 3, or chapter 2 and chapter 3. So these women, the one name was Orpah, and the other name was Ruth. Now, I find this interesting. Ruth means friend. Ruth means friend. And they dwelled there about 10 years. So they lived there, they dwelled there for about 10 years. Now look at verse number 5. Then both Wasting and Puny died. Probably the reason that they died was because of their conditions, right? I mean, why would you give your son the name of Wasting and Puny? Probably because they're not in very good health. Okay, they were very sickly. They were very poor in health. Therefore, they passed away. So now, you look at this situation. You had 3 happy families, 3 people who were married. Now you have 3 widowed women. 3 women that are now widowed, not having any husband and not having a lineage to go forth. So look at the end of verse number 5. So the woman survived her 2 sons, and her husband. Now, what's going to happen here as we read this is, because there is no men involved in this, the land that Naomi owns, the possessions that she has, she can't own them. Okay, she cannot possess these things because there's no man involved. Okay, there's nothing there that she can do. There's nothing that she can't even sell it for a profit, because there's no man, there's no husband, there's no sons involved. And that's really why this whole story of Ruth is taking place, is because we got to have a man, we got to have a lineage that we can get to Christ, that we can be able to get to the seed of Abraham. Now look at verse number 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard from the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Now, remember that. Okay? What is the Lord providing here in chapter number 1 and verse number 6? He's providing them bread, isn't he? Okay, he's providing them the nourishment, the food that he is needing during this critical time. Now, when we get to chapter number 3, we're going to reference back to this verse, so keep it in mind. Put a star by it, circle it. We're going to come back to it. Now, look at verse number 7. Therefore, she went out of the place where she was, and two daughter-in-laws with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Now, as she is looking at all this pain that's going on in her life, I mean, I want you to think about this just for a second. From verse number 1 down to verse number 5, notice what Naomi lost. She lost, number 1, her husband. She lost, number 2, her children, her 2 sons. And number 3, she lost her possessions. Remember, she had farmland. They were harvesting wheat and barley and those different types of things during this day. And they lost all of them because of the law during that time. She lost all those things. Now, look at verse number 8. Because she had lost all those things, she forgot about the blessings that were right in front of her face. Look at this verse. Look at verse number 8. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. She says, look, ladies, Y'all go home. Y'all go back to your own towns and live with your family. Don't worry about me. Just leave me alone and go away. She had lost all these things. Think about the pain that Naomi is going through right now. And because of this pain, she was blind to think about and see these two daughter-in-laws that she had and the blessing that they could be to her life. That's what many times people do, right? What happens in their life? They go through many types of pain. They go through different types of circumstances in their life, and they forget about the blessing that's right in front of their eyes because they're blinded by it. They're so focused on the pain and the things that's been taken away from them that they forget about these blessings. These two daughter-in-laws were blessings to her eyes, and we're going to see that one was truly a blessing to her as we continue reading. Look at verse 9. And the Lord will grant you and find you rest, each in your own house of their husbands. So she kissed them and lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. So it says, let us go with you. Let us go back with you to your people. But look at Naomi's response. Remember, she's in a lot of pain. And remember what her name means. Pleasant one, right? Is she pleasant? No. She's bitter. She is heartbroken. And she's not living up to her name. Naomi said in verse number 11, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that you may be your husbands? Because remember, during this time, as we're going to see and reiterate in chapter number 3, during this time, the law said that if a husband died, the one closest to them, the closest kin to them, was the one that they were to marry to keep the family lineage going and things like that, to be able to possess their lands and all those different types of things. So what is Naomi saying in verse number 11? She goes, I'm past childbearing years. There's no way I'm having a baby. Go find somebody else. Just go home, do your own thing. Verse 12, turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband and also a child. For if I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they are grown? She's basically saying, look, there's no reason for you to stay around. Even if I was to bear a child tonight, are you going to wait some 15, some number of years later to be able to marry this man, to be able to redeem our family? Would you restrain yourselves, verse 13, from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me so much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. She's bitter. This woman has a hard heart. She is blaming the Lord against. She says, Lord just got it out against me. I've just got bad luck. You need to get away from me so that you can get away from this pain. But look at verse 14. Then they lifted up their voices and wept, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. I find it interesting, the difference response between these two ladies. One of them said, okay, you talked me into it. I'm going to kiss you. That's a way in which they departed ways during that time. And the second one clung to her. And look at what the response was. Ruth's response in verse 15. She goes, and she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone to her people and to, notice this phrase, her gods. Obviously, these women from Moab were what? Pagans, right? They believed in a polytheistic system of religion. And she says, look, go back to your land and go back to your gods. But notice Ruth's response, return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, this is probably a verse that many of you can quote, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. Wherever you go, I will go. For wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. And notice this last phrase. Remember what Naomi said. Go back to your land and worship your many gods, little g gods and plural gods. But what did Ruth say? And your God will be my God. Singular, capital G God. I think that just shows the influence that people can have on their religion. I mean, here it is, Ruth, a Moabite, living in a pagan society, living during the times of the judges, right? Doing things in their own eyes. And she goes and she has influence by Naomi and her family. And what does she say? She says, I don't want to go back to my gods. I don't want to go back to my people. I want to stay with you, and I want to worship the true and the living God. Notice how she concludes her statement to her mother-in-law. Where you die, I will die, and where you will be buried, the Lord do so to me, and more also. But if anything but death departs from you and me. And when she saw that she had determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. I mean, here this is, this great blessing of, hey, I'm going to cling to you. Wherever you go, I'm going to go. I'm just going to ignore you. I'm not even going to speak to you. That's what her response finally was. Now, let's see how this chapter of pain concludes. It says, now the two of them waited until they came to Bethlehem, and it happened as they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? Look, she's come back home, right? She is coming back to her family. It is Naomi. Now look at verse 20, talking about names. That's the importance to understand here, the context and the meaning of these names. But she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Don't call me sweet one. Don't call me loving one. But call me Martha. What does Martha mean? Read the rest of the verse. For the Almighty God has dwelt very bitterly with me. What she's saying is that, hey, don't call me pleasant one. I'm not pleasant anymore. I've had a lot of pain in my life, and because of this pain, call me Mara, which means bitter. I am bitter towards God. And then notice these last two verses. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So chapter number 1, a lot of pain, a lot of affliction that happened in these ladies' lives. And because of this pain, we're going to go to chapter number 2, which is going to show the process. Think about Naomi's responses so far. Negative. Go home. Get away from her. Not even going to talk to her. But notice this process that happens in chapter 2. You're going to see that bitterness, remember that's what she's saying to call him. Call me Mara, which means bitter, is going to come back to pleasant one. She's finally going to say a positive statement in chapter number 2. Let's notice it. This is the process. Now look at verse number 1. There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a great man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. Now Boaz means strength. I find that interesting. The two sons of Naomi were puny and wasting. And if you know the story of Naomi, who's Ruth going to marry? She's going to marry Boaz, right? And what does his name mean? Strength, strong. So Ruth, verse number 2, the Moabite said to Naomi, please let me go in the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I can find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. I'm sure she was probably annoyed by her and says, get out of here. Okay? But one thing that we're going to notice about this process is about Ruth's humbleness. What is Ruth always willing to do throughout this book? Be a servant, right? What does she say in chapter number 1? I'll go wherever you go. I'll lodge where you lodge. And here in chapter number 2, she says, let me go out to the fields and work. And while I work, let me bring home some food. Right? And that's eventually what she's going to do here in chapter number 2. Then she left and went to glean the fields after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Verse number 4, and now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered and said, the Lord blesses you. And Boaz said to his servants, who is in charge of the reapers? Whose young woman is this? Now, think about this. Boaz is watching these servants work, and there's this woman, Ruth, out there working. And what he asks here in verse number 5 is simply, hey, whose servant is this? Whose woman is this? Whose servant is she? Verse number 6 says, so the servant who was in charge of the reapers answer says, it is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came, and she has continued from the morning until now through the rested a little in the house. So they have this relationship. Obviously, Boaz knows the relationship, right? But it hasn't sunk in what he can do and help this family, to be the redeemer, to be the kinsman, as the King James Version actually calls it. And we'll talk more about that as this story unfolds. Then Boaz, I got to keep going. I'm going to summarize this. Ruth works for Boaz in the field. Now, when she gets done working, what happens is she takes some barley, she takes some food home to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And I want us to notice Naomi's response. Look at verse number 17. So she gleaned in the fields until the evening and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it and she went to the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought out and gave her wheat she had kept back after she had been satisfied. Now notice verse 19. And her mother-in-law said to her, where have you gleaned today? Where did you get this food at? And where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you. I want you to think about the whole book so far. Has Naomi said one positive thing? No, but this is I actually have in the margin of my Bible a plus sign, because that's the first positive interaction that we've seen out of Naomi. Remember, this is a process. She's hardened of heart. Now we're seeing that hard heart being softened. And how is it being softened? By the providential care of God. Look at verse number 20. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be the Lord God who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said to her, this man is a relative, or is a relation of ours, one of our closest relatives. What is Naomi thinking right now? Hey, you need to marry this man, and you need to marry this man so we can keep the family lineage going, so we can get the field back, so we can continue to live life like we were before. Finally, some positive things. Remember, this is a process. Sometimes you got to go through pain, and you got to go through a process to get the results that God wants us to get. And that's what we see here in this book. And then notice what Ruth said. Verse 21, he said to me, you shall stay by my young men until you have finished all the harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth and daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out there with his young women, and the people do not meet you in any other field. And so she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law. So she stayed close by during this time. Now, chapter number 3 is the power. The power of love really is what this whole chapter is about. Now look at verse number 1. Verse number 1 kind of shows us the whole rest of what we need to know in chapter number 3. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is whining barley tonight at the threshing floor. Basically, let me just put it in layman's terms. Hey, he's a kinsman. You can marry him to keep our family lineage going and get back our possessions. You need to marry him. And you need to do it tonight while he's at the threshing floor. Now, when you read verse number 2, let me just say very quickly about this threshing floor. The threshing floor was equipment, okay? You know, as you drive down all these, I love being in South Georgia because they got fields, and I mean, you don't have that in North Georgia. All you got is mountains, okay, which is pretty too. But you go down here and you see all these fields. What happens? You see over in the corner, right, a shed, and you got all their tractors under it. And what do? They got it all locked up, right? Well, during this time, they didn't have those technology things. They didn't have those things. So what they had to do was they had to sleep out in the field with their equipment. The threshing floor was basically kind of like a drag, and it went over the wheat, and it sheathed it, and all those different types of things. You can read about that. But he had to sleep with his equipment because he didn't want it to get stolen. So he's out there in the field with this threshing floor sleeping. She says, go out there. Verse number 3 says, wash yourself, put on your best garment, go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and he will go uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do. Now, basically, let me summarize this. She says, go out there. He's laying by the threshing floor. We know where he is. Go talk to him. Now, he's going to be asleep when you get there. Uncover his feet. Okay. Now, what they did, remember, they wore like these garments that would cover their whole body like a coat. And what they would do is, that was their pillow. That was their covers at night as well. So he took off his coat, his garment, and that's what he used as covers. And she says, hey, uncover his feet. Eventually his feet's going to get cold enough that he's going to wake up and he's going to see you at his feet. And you need to talk to him about this situation. Okay? And those, Ruth's response, all do you say that all that you say to me I will do. So verse number 6 tells us that she went down to the threshing floor to talk to this man. Look at verse number 9 of chapter number 3. And he said, who are you? So he answered and says, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative. Does anybody have a different translation there besides you are a close relative? Redeemer. Okay. I think that's what a lot of translations use, and that's exactly what this is talking about. I think the old King James uses the word kinsman or kingsman or something like that effect. But really, it's just saying, hey, you're a relative. You are a close relative. You are going to be able to redeem our family, our lineage. You're going to be able to buy us back and to keep that going. And that's the whole purpose of this book there in verse number 9. Verse 10, notice his response. Then he said, blessed are you to the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, in what you did not to go after the young man, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all the request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. He says, hey, Ruth, you're a special woman. You're not just a woman that means special to me, but you have a good reputation throughout the whole town. You're a virtuous woman. Proverbs chapter 31 talks about the price of a virtuous woman, how that their worth is far above rubies. But it's kind of a heartbreaking story here in verse number 12. Not really, because we know the end of the story, but if you're reading this, you're like, no, this is awful. Verse 12, now it is true that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. And basically what's going to happen in the rest of this chapter is, hey, we got to go get permission from this closer relative than I, but if he won't marry you, I can marry you. But we got to have his permission first. We got to have his blessing to be able to skip over him to get to me. Verse number 14 says, so she lay down at his feet until morning, and she arose before anyone could recognize another. Then he said, do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. What is he saying there? She's leaving before dawn, right? She's leaving before daybreak, and she's saying, hey, don't tell anybody you're out here. What would that do to her reputation? Out there in the middle of a field with a man at night. It would ruin her reputation. He says, leave before sunrise, and leave and don't tell anybody. And that's exactly what they do. So they go and they talk to this man. Let's see. Let's look at chapter number 4. Chapter 4 is the purpose of love, and that's to redeem this family. I'm going to summarize this because I want to talk about the next slide very quickly. Basically, how this story closes out is they go to this closer relative than Boaz. You don't even know his name. I find that interesting. That's how important he really is. but he says, hey, you're a redeemer. You can redeem this woman and her family. Do you want to do it? And basically, the reason he says no, look at I believe it's verse number 6. And the close relative says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem the right of redemption for yourselves, for I cannot redeem it. Probably what's happening by that statement is this man, this other person that's closer than Boaz, had other kids, had other relatives, and he says, hey, I can't do that because it's going to mess up my kids' inheritance. I don't want to have to split the inheritance up. He goes, it's better to just you marry her. That way there's no splitting up the inheritance, is essentially what he's saying. Look at verse number 8. Therefore, the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. So he took off his sandals. Now, why is it that Boaz took off his sandals? He's taking off his sandals, and he's going to step into the feet of Elimelech. He's saying, hey, I'm not going to step into my sandals anymore. I'm going to step into this family, and I'm going to keep this family going. So I'm stepping in to Elimelech's lineage. And, of course, we know what happens. You look at verse number 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And then the woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be a famous in Israel. May it be great in Israel. And you look at the end of chapter number 4, verses 18 through 22, what do you see there? You see all them names again, right? You see the lineage. What's the purpose of this chapter? To redeem this family and to keep the lineage of Christ coming. Now, very quickly as we close, think about Boaz. Think about Boaz and what he did. Remember in the Bible there's types and antitypes. Boaz is a type of Christ. You think about the ark, and we talk about how it is a type of the church. Think about baptism and the flood of the type whereunto the light fear baptism doth also now save us. 1 Peter 3, 20 and 21. Here in this story, we look at Boaz, and we have to understand Boaz is a type of Christ. He's symbolic in this story of being Christ. I want you to think about it. Think about what we are. We are alienated from Christ, right? We are sinners, alienated from Christ. What was Ruth? She was a Moabite woman, right? She was alienated. She wasn't God's people. She was a stranger. Read Ephesians chapter 2, 11 and 12 about that figure of speech there, talking about how that we are strangers and God took us in. Think about what, I don't even have these points up here, but think about what Boaz did as far as it relates to the family. He was the head of that family. He came into this family, and he went into this family and basically kind of adopted them. Think about what God did for us. He adopted us. We are children of God. We are heirs of Christ. But very quickly, notice this. Boaz was the Lord of harvests. God is our Lord of harvest. Boaz was the I can't even say that word, of bread. He was the giver of bread, is the way I like to say it. And what does God give us? He is our provider. He is the one that provides us bread. I told you to kind of mark that in your Bible about there, and I think it's actually chapter number 2. I know he talks about it in verse 3 and verse 15 as well. But there when she works in the field all day and she sends that wheat, that barley home with Ruth to give to Naomi, right? What did she give? They gave bread. What is Jesus for us? He's the bread of life, right? I think it's John chapter 8 there, that He is our bread of life. There's a great parallel there about how that Jesus is bread, about Boaz is the giver of that bread. Also, Boaz is the giver of rest. Chapter 3 and verse number 1. What does Jesus say? In Matthew chapter 10, about being and giving rest. He says, come unto me, all ye that labor and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart. I think that's interesting, these relationships. He was a man of wealth. Remember, he was rich. He had these servants. He had these people working for him in his vineyard, in his pastures, in his farm. But God is our one of wealth. He owns everything, right? Cattle upon 1,000 hills. Cliff Goodwin was preaching for us 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, and he was talking about stewardship and all the different things. And he says that one time in class, somebody said, "Well, about that 1,001th hill? Who owns that cattle upon that 1,001th hill?" God owns that too. God owns everything. God owns everything. And he is the man of wealth, just like Boaz was in this story. I love this story of Ruth. It's very short, but yet very powerful. I mean, you go back and you look at these things. You look at how pain was inflicted. Let me stop right here and just say one thing. I know you know Brother Kirk Brothers. He did a lesson on Ruth at Polishing the Pulpit several years ago. I didn't go to this session, but me and Cliff were talking about another session that Kirk Brothers did that was probably one of the best ones on evangelism I've ever heard, besides Rob Whitaker's seminar. And we were talking about that lesson. He says, "Did you hear the one that he did on Ruth?" I said, "No, I need to go listen to it." And in that sermon, Kirk Brothers said this: "I know it's titled Ruth. I know this whole book is entitled Ruth, but who's this whole story about? It's really about Naomi." Think about it. Chapter 1, it was about Naomi's pain. Chapter number 2, it was about Naomi's process, the heart that she went through. Chapter number 3 is the power that happens because of God and the power that was given to Naomi. In chapter number 4, what was the whole purpose of this book? To redeem Naomi's family. Now, Ruth's the main character. She's the one that makes things happen, but really, it's about Naomi. Now, I love that point. The more I study this, the more I see that, and I also see God's providential care. If you take one thing from this story, remember these two things. Why is the book of Ruth important? Number one, to show the lineage to Christ and to redeem his people, which is a parallel in this book. But also, number two, to show the providential loving care of our Father. Providence with something we can't understand. It's something that we can't fathom with. But we got to know it's there and that God loves us and that he's not a deist God. He's not just stepping away and watching it, but he's interacting with us and he loves us so much that he shows his providential care. Any questions or comments as we close? All right, we'll take a little bit of a break, then we'll begin worship, I guess, at 10:30. Thank y'all for y'all's kind attention.